Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Poitiers, fought on September the 19th, 1356, between the French army commanded by King John II, known as the Good, and an Anglo-Gascon one under Edward, the Black Prince, as one of the most important clashes of the Hundred-Year War, definitely Crecy and Azincourt only being more important. This was also the peak of Edward of Woodstock's military career. Right, this battle, as we will see, is not just famously huge spoiler for people living in the underworld, a clamorous English victory, but in fact also a very skillfully fought one from the English side, and we will analyze this now in tactical detail. I come back making a battle video after a long time, which is totally random, even though it takes some extra day to prepare these, because we analyze. Unfortunately, we can't actually every single source of the battle, and I will actually try to make it simple, right? Because there are at least 20 contemporary accounts on the battle, more or less contemporary, let's say, that really present a picture that is difficult to reconstruct by making every single narrative overlap. As a matter of fact, sources disagree on a great deal of things, but these are often details in some form. They have to do also with the chronological order which they use, which is often messed up, and or at least we shouldn't be reading the accounts as if they literally follow that chronological sequence, and a lot of other aspects that, in fact, only reading the actual accounts would bring us to point out. The reason why I don't do this is, first of all, there are too many. So if I had to prepare just a single video about the entire battle, and I'm not saying that methodologically this is the best option, but it would take forever, like even just multiple weeks, and also to read the entire historiography existing on this, which is consistent, and it shows you, if anything, how scholars disagree more than anything, whereas the sources in themselves draw anyway still a coherent picture, right? And I definitely read the most important accounts, and I can tell you that if I were to make the video about that, you would maybe not fall asleep more than you already do probably during my multi-hours long videos, but it would somehow not help recompacting this picture. That is the reason why I actually make this specific videos, right? Where I make, say, a video on some battles that I studied in the entirety of themselves. I would probably make an entire series. For example, for the Battle of Doornkruit of 1278, I would make a series, talking also about the sources in general, in depth, historical context, etc. Instead, as you know, especially those of you who have been following me for quite a while, I have my battles playlist, and these are take a couple of hours long videos, sometimes also longer analysis of the battle, which usually in other videos on YouTube you get in 15 minutes at most, and instead I try to analyze a bit from the basis that, again, I may not give you entirely in the video. Right? Imagine I start to read the entire Latin passage and translating properly, showing you all the semantic problem. It would be a problem for the video, not much for the reconstruction. I agree, but that's exactly why also you don't find, however, this kind of depth I'm not aware of anywhere on YouTube. Like most of other content I've seen, basically just makes an introduction, tells a story, but it doesn't also necessarily tell you how, for example, this battle fits in a broader history of the art of war, why, for example, the Battle of Poitiers is so relevant, we will see now, for understanding the so much discussed tactics of the 100 Years' War and why we have made perhaps too much fuss about them, whereas if you study them from a kind of continental background scale of military historical knowledge, they would seem much easier, much plainer, and somewhat more homogeneous also in terms properly of tactics than you may imagine. And I'm glad about this, talking about this battle, also because so far I talked only about the Battle of Formigny as far as the 100 Years' War are concerned. I made last year introductory videos about the 100 Years' War. We talked about it here and there. And recently we made a video also about the French army organization during this, let's call it first phase of the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Poitiers would eventually lead to the Treaty of Bretigny, right, between the French and the English, that somewhat settled the first phase, what was called usually the first phase of the 100 Years' War. But these were, as you know, also several campaigns that were not part of a continuous operational situation, as it was normal, of course, at the time. The year before, for example, the Black Prince had already ravaged the southwest of France, sacked Narbonne, unopposed, by the way, largely. The 1356 chevauchée of Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, is considered one of the most important, if not maybe the most important campaign of the 100 Years' War for the scale, especially of the chevauchée, and of course of the outcome of the battle. This is debatable, but given that the King of France was literally taken prisoner at Poitiers, well, this, as you know, surely puts the battle and the campaign next to definitely Crécy and Azincourt. There is a connection, especially between, as you understand, just temporarily, with Crécy. It was just the decade before, where Edward III, the father of the Black Prince, and from the other side, Philip VI, it was the father of John II in France, had fought, and that was also a ruinous French defeat. This is a bit the trend you get, as you know, during the 100 Years' War as far as the pitched battles are concerned. And you know, if you have been following me, that I've been, considering, importantly, this, the interpretation, method, of historical analysis concerning the outcome of these battles, the same method concerning the analysis of the battle accounts, and generally speaking, the general distrust that I have towards historiography and the superficiality sometimes of the judgment, especially from certain academic backgrounds that privilege the scholarly interpretation as opposed to the source analysis, right? Not that I have a deep distrust towards, as you know, whatever is being said. As a matter of fact, very often good things are said, and then other people come and say lots of other things that are somewhat unnecessary to complicate the picture because they want their place in the Hall of Fame. And so the audience, the readers, whoever gets interested in these topics, very often cannot distinguish, but that was the one that is getting it right or not. And as I was saying at the beginning, Poitiers is an interesting example of this because scholarship recognizes that there are lots of obscure points about this battle. But the battle itself is not that obscure, right? We can definitely discuss now, for example, the battlefield is the protagonist of the clash, the position of especially of the English army. There have been many observations regarding the ground where the battle was fought, which is essentially in between. In fact, it's known in France mostly as the Battle of Maupertuis. That, as we will see, is a village, was at the time laying on the Roman road that went to Poitiers between Beauvoir and Noyers. That is where the English army was essentially encamped the day before the battle, in the attempt to cross the Miasson River. Here I put a map, you will see it easily, to retreat to Bordeaux, because the chevauchée had started from Gascony, had reached the heart of France, the Berry, etc. Then when the French Royal Army put itself in motion, by the way, with a significant mobility in spite of the size of it, as we'll see, was actually smaller than the early 14th century French, and generally speaking, what the European average had been in comparison to this moment of instead post-Black Death and contraction. In fact, really was particularly mobile, and put the English in important difficulties because, first of all, the French army, as we'll see, was significantly larger. There is a debate on the numbers here, but surely it was a massive threat, and it was playing a very dangerous strategic game because it was essentially almost succeeding in cutting off the English retreat route to Gascony. Right, so the Black Prince wasn't actually even that willing to fight this battle. He just found himself in this situation because the days before battle, first of all, these armies had crossed even the same tracks that were marching on, almost actually crashing against one another. There had been skirmishes. The English had been victorious, but these were small engagements. And the broader strategic outlook was definitely not that pink for the English. And as the French were pressing on them, also the problem of supplies was increasing, because the English had carried out the successful chevauchée at the end of the campaign, where eventually the English come back to Gascony, had crossed 1,100 kilometers, right, raiding second. And in here, the Prince of Wales had been very effective, methodic, ruthless. That's probably also the way he had sacked Narbonne the year before. Later on, he wouldn't treat the population of Limoges well either. This idea of the black, this kind of dark, this dark fame. There are debates regarding his military capacities. Politically, he's said not to have won the hearts of Gascony, that, as you know, was an important English base, was not entirely in the hands of the English. So that's also why, in part, these chevauchés started from their side, from the obvious relevance. Consider Gascony was producing even more than all the English costumes at the time. Bordeaux was essentially larger than London, possibly also richer. So the English cared very much about their French, their Gascon, let's say, better properly, possession in France broadly meant. And so these chevauchés, what business they were systematic devastation. And the English were carrying them out, hoping to show the French vassals and subjects how impotent the monarch was. And that was a serious moment in France because of the general mid-14th century crisis. France was a massive system and properly already a state, a demographic and agricultural giant, so there were many forces agitating within it. And England, that was definitely not more powerful, but was more compact and especially more unitarily controlled, and this is also not to be given for granted. Most of this is owed to Edward III, who was not just the greatest and most complete military genius in English history, but also, in fact, a great sovereign that accompanied his military reforms with necessarily a statal institutional reform, and that would perfect what would know, in fact, as the say general, if not standard English tactics of the 100 Years' War, had managed to exploit this difficulty. As you know, after the victory at Crécy, the English had gained Calais, that they would maintain well into up to the 16th century, even after the end of the 100 Years' War. He had the word is nobleman, now naturally connected with the court, and in this case properly the Prince of Wales, but there were other more autonomous expeditions in France where the English nobility essentially spent vacations looting and raiding and so on. And in this actually also sparing England of the normal devastations that in fact would have occurred and had occurred, as you know, in English history also during moments of civil war and so on. And this doesn't mean, by the way, that England wasn't spending resources for these expeditions. As a matter of fact, they were quite costly and they were a problem for the same English. That's also why they got to this Treaty of Bretigny later on. So conversely, from the French side, it was very important to score a significant victory against these harassers, strategically speaking. And naturally, there was a lot of, let's say, of blame already in France towards the monarchy, and from different sides, right? Every estate kind of thought their own thing. The Battle of Poitiers, with the defeat of the French army and the capture of the king and so many noblemen, would de facto also trigger the Grande Jacquerie, right? So essentially a revolution ante litteram, and that was literally the greatest peasant revolt in medieval history, that however failed on the longer run, as the peasants were brutally put down by the nobility that retained a firm control on the country, by fragmenting it. As you know, this battle is interesting because at this point France is an entire France, but already Philip the Bold, that earned this nickname at Poitiers itself, as he stood with his father till the end, his father John, King of France, and being captured eventually, but becoming Duke of Burgundy, and so the founder of that, say that political direction more than anything that brought the duchy to, as you know, essentially behave like a different state within and outside the same France, and also aligning himself with the English and so on, and surfing the wave of all the tensions that were occurring with the peasantry, with the bourgeoisie of Paris and so on. But this is history we'll see later. But it does derive, later, in the channel, and I already made videos on that, not today definitely, but it, in a sense, began from the crisis that such military defeats opened, notoriously enough. So there was definitely a lot at stake, and this was definitely understood. And on the other hand, this was basically the right gamble, right? The King of France was meant to chase back these English armies that sometimes were successfully cornered, either against the sea or some river, like even in this case, as a matter of fact, and albeit with a different outcome, in fact, eventually starved and captured and so on. So here the son of the English king, son and heir of the English king, was leading such expedition, successfully striking the heart of France, and therefore there was a massive reaction, because the army mobilized by the French was was remarkable, to counter it, to crush it, to hopefully capture or kill the same Prince of Wales, and this also avenging the defeat of Crécy. And as I have explained multiple times when talking about these battles, yes, you cannot eliminate from the equation the fact that there is definitely a structural reason why the French lost these battles, but that at the same time, this doesn't mean that there were particularly evident strategic or tactical mistakes, right? That there is not very often much that you can do other than what eventually was done historically. In the same version of the battle that today we will discuss, that I follow after Alfred Byrne, that is in fact one of the first, actually the first military historian who began to assess an important analogical method that contemplates the fact that medieval leaders, or ancient commanders and so on, always made essentially the same strategic choices reasonably that a 20th century chief of staff would fundamentally do, right? To fill the gap that of course we have in terms of what were these commanders thinking, which we don't necessarily have from the sources, or even when this is told, doesn't literally mean the truth. Not that was not the reality, broadly speaking, but that even small differences in the way these leaders would have seen the thing and issued their orders compared to the way that they were eventually recorded can make an important difference. And John II in this actually behaved properly, and especially from a strategic point of view, skillfully maneuvered his army to almost cut off and eventually to actually succeeding in cornering the Anglo-Gascon army. The tactical thing we will discuss throughout the video, but John II, also for the fact that he was captured, is, I remember my high school history professor saying John II, known as the Good for Nothing because he had been captured, has generated this idea that he was somehow the usual idiot, that incompetent idiot that leads his men to defeat because he's not capable of commanding. And basically, the entire prejudice that we have decided to create, surprise, surprise, ever since the masses came to power in history, to delegitimize authority, competence, hierarchy, and so on. And as a matter of fact, it's been, assessed today that John II was a competent ruler, a competent leader, and he also worked very hard in his life to fix the problems that he had himself experienced with the defeat of his father at the Battle of Crécy. That had been a disaster where the French carried out, if I'm not wrong, 23 charges up to night time to try to break the English array, and not necessarily because that was the wrong thing to do, but because of the general, let's say, lack of a comprehensive reform and kind of, let's say, reorganization properly of the French military system that was an old issue that at some point you have to cope with, even if it costs a lot, and that we have seen, in fact, in the aforementioned video about the medieval French organization. I have a medieval France and a French warfare playlist that you can check out in that sense. And that consisted mostly in problems, again, in fact, of quite technical ones, of organization, of hierarchy, of command, of standardization. Issues that were not really showing, say, any particular backwardness, especially compared to most countries in Europe of the French military system, but that was that was somehow necessary to fix, given that the French army was huge. The system of recruitment was one of a bigger country with people drawn from different places. So the necessity of regulating all the processes that went from the unit's organization, supplies, discipline, how these men were supposed to fight and would control their behavior on the battlefield is something that was started being fixed, especially after Crécy, by the same John II. Those reforms, in this sense, failed because he was captured, because the country went upside down. As a consequence, France had to pay a huge ransom, not just for the king, of course, but for an important amount of the French nobility captured by the English on that day. But this doesn't mean that, of course, the broader reforms had been the wrong ones, or that this monarch was essentially incapable, or that this defeat actually speaks necessarily of a general disaster in which the French army really burst. Right? This is a much more complex issue that, again, I explain elsewhere. I don't need to digress on it today, because the video will probably be atrociously long already by itself. But it's very important to bear it in mind, right? His John II's son, the Dauphin. There were multiple of his sons in the army at Poitiers. Charles, the future King Charles V of France, gets more credit as a ruler. Definitely by 1380, he had basically expelled the English from most of the French territories and so on. But it's the complexity of the system that you have to look at, rather than evaluating just the single performance, say even of command of the leaders, and saying, well, this guy was an idiot just because he lost fundamentally. It doesn't work well as a broader concept. As a matter of fact, and more importantly, in all of these battles, the English were not faring well at all, right? Especially the position of the Prince of Wales at the Battle of Poitiers was even worse tactically than the one of his father at Crécy. And generally speaking, things could go seriously bad for the English, who, as we will see throughout all the battle, risked to be defeated, and as they were also in a, generally speaking, strategically disadvantageous situation in the first place. What else could I add? We can start from the properly giving an outline of the battle, making this further premise regarding the historiographical picture. Like, we're not going to list the various opinions expressed on the battle. More or less, they all agree today. I think there is a standard view how this battle was fought that fundamentally is similar in all the versions, both for the for the deployment, let's say, in relation to the ground, geographically where it was fought, and so on. And so we can look at the map mostly. I decide to follow Burns' version of the story, which is old, and however is importantly convincing, first of all, but the guy was competent, as we were recalling before. I've checked other more updated studies, and fundamentally the uncertainty on the battle and the historiographical interpretations regarding that are somehow still there. We will explain exactly now what the main problem is. There is also, for those who read Ospreys, that I remember making a video about about at least answering someone that was asking whether ospreys are good or not. I have the volume about the Battle of Poitiers, as I have almost all of them, as a matter of fact, literally all the thousands, and I read it, and it's good, right? It makes it makes an important use of source quoting for, say, adding up to the substance of the narrative, but it skips completely, let's say, the broader historiographical, say, the root of the interpretational divergences, right? They tell you maybe this guy did this, but it doesn't tell you why he says maybe, right? He should have made a much more thorough analysis of, I think it's Nicole that wrote that, and analysis of terrain. And on ospreys, you don't see that. I mean, it's not much the author's fault, but generally speaking, the fact that they have to tell the story, how they think it went. And again, on this specific aspect, as we will see, there are divergences, because again, the sources say different things about the same topic, and so we cannot pick one and say, well, this is actually the one that told the truth. There isn't quite such a thing, right? There are more or less likely things, and I personally think Burns' interpretation is very convincing, and it makes especially a lot of logical military sense, right? So first of all, the main problem has to do with the ground. So here I hope to remember which piece of the track it is so that I can insert the picture, but it probably already appeared, and it will stay throughout the video on. You have the area where this battle was fought. As I was saying before, so here we are basically, I think 8 kilometers southeast of Poitiers, right? The French, here you don't see the French camp nor the English camp, but still the area of the English one at least is included in the map. The French had spent the previous night encamped at the local Bishop of Poitiers palace, where of course the king had stayed with the hired nobles. That is close to here, and the distances are fine. There are a few kilometers that not even, so that we don't have to be concerned about that, because we know exactly the point. I know that in the early 20th century there was a French version, because Burns criticized that regarding the deployment of the French army that has been surpassed, but there is a mild debate, as we will see, regarding the extension of the front of the battle, as well as its inclination that may make the thing, let's say, change a little bit. But fundamentally, instead, the English had encamped between what you see here in the east, Beauvoir and Noyer. Noyer is across the Miasson River. Especially there is this. There are two crossings, one at Noyer and one at, you see here, Gué de l'Homme, and just next to Noyer you have the wood, the forêt of Noyer. And the French, and the English were stationed in this area. Now, the size of the armies, first of all, to give an idea, here you have also the scale of the distances. One debate concerns the fact of the English movements during the same day of the battle. Basically, the two armies had arrived in these positions the day before, and there had been some negotiations, right, that were carried out specifically from the French side by the Cardinal of Périgord, that had been sent properly as a papal ambassador, by the way, because the Avignonese papacy interest lay with the French, and they didn't like the instability that the English invasion, the Chevauché, was causing naturally. Eventually, this cardinal would side with the French. His house, his relatives would even fight in battle, so much that the Prince of Wales eventually would send back one dead of them one of the cardinals relative with his regards, because you're the one who negotiates. You're a man of spirit, and then you make your own relatives fighting against the same English. I mean, of course, it's a respectable position from a French side, but that's just because there are many anecdotes about this battle. It tells you a bit about also the chivalric ideals and so on. We'll perhaps mention them, but I would like to make the video as say tactical as possible, because very often these battles are not well reconstructed in the first place. For example, if you I use, as you know, Wikimedia Commons pictures, and this is a battle that, in fact, as you notice here, you can find maps and images about, and if you search for that and you pick the first maps that you see, also the shinier ones, the one digitally made, you'll see a brutal simplification, right, of the terrain, of the deployment. You don't find any legend. You don't really you realize that those who made them were just making a sort of sketch, and a pretty superficial one. I mean, everything is a sketch. Every map is approximated, but it can be done better or worse. Here, for example, the terrain, as you probably realized, is crucial in many ways. So there's a first debate regarding the fact that the English were essentially trying to get out of this position. It took time to cross rivers, and the French naturally were, let's say, the English had stopped the day before. There were clashes, say skirmishes, during the night, for which seemingly also the English had not slept so comfortably, because they were the pressured ones, right? So, as we were saying before, the French had the upper hand strategically, and their problem was essentially buying time for themselves, naturally, to approach the English, but also not so much to allow the English to escape. And the English could escape through the crossing of the Meuse south towards Bordeaux and so on. Now, the problem is, as we were saying before, that the sources make clear that the English were running out of food, and especially of water. And that's why also they had to reach the Meuse in the previous days, and they were tired for the long march, etc. But it was necessary for their logistical needs. And the story goes that a part of the, you see, as we were saying, the English were loaded with the wagons of the loot and so on. They were a sizable army. We will talk about the numbers in a while. And it says that when on September 19th in the morning, the battle lasted some hours, right? By noon it was over, at least in the fight. The English had already began to cross the Meuse, right? A vanguard of theirs. Now, these sources create already problems regarding who was crossing what, because here we have essentially three battles, as in the norm, and as we will see, there are Warwick, the Prince of Wales, and Salisbury. And this means naturally that they were marching in some of a battle asset of sort, because of course when you are in enemy territory, and especially like in this case, you can be attacked, you have to be ready to redeploy in a battle formation. Hopefully a battle line, but as we will see, this is part of the debate, because as I've seen, most reconstructions, including the Osprey ones, put the English deployment as a single line, like with all the three battles on a lined up next to each other. I like Burns' interpretation. The English formation was in depth, as also the French one was, because they wouldn't attack in a single line, and that's clear instead. But I will explain better why I think from a military logical point of view, that would have been the case for the English as well. And so there was this important maneuver that brought to the redeployment of an English army already on the move in a battle formation. And sources say that we can't know that, however, the decision to deploy where eventually the English would was taken at the moment. That is to say, of course, the Black Prince had already spot probably the place where the battle would take place. That is quite an interesting one. Here you see essentially there is a little road that follows, that is probably also the one that the French followed from the main Roman one to Poitiers, that eventually splits, if you see it, between Maupertuis and this kind of marshy area just in front, the darker green one in front of the English army. This aspect especially is deeply important. And actually in Burns' reconstruction, from whom I've not taken this map, this is taken from another study, but it would bring the two roads, you see, the black ones that go one towards Noyer, right, going the one on the right, going past the wood, or around the wood actually, and the one that goes straight through, at least in this picture, the English deployment up to the fording of the Gueux de l'Homme. In Burns' map, it's really the same thing, except these two roads are the ones on which what you see here, A, B, that is Warwick and Salisbury, would have deployed respectively on. Right, so this map is slightly different from Burns for that reason, but it doesn't change eventually the essence of the map. I could have adjusted it myself by redrawing the roads. Naturally, it means that, I mean, geography does not change. So Burn drew it also on the base of some studies that have been carried out on the terrain at the time. I think, you know, nothing changed, of course, also in terms of references and so on. And so it can slightly vary. Probably Burns' one is more accurate in some way, or at least it's more logically drawn, and I like it more because it makes more sense. And objectively, if that's where the French would have been expected to cross, probably the two English battles, at least the two front lines, were deployed respectively on those two roads. But regarding the Maupertuis hill here, the elevations are not very high. If you check on Google Maps with the reliefs indicator, like, you can't even distinguish them. So they're not big reliefs here. They change just in some meter, right? At best some tens of meters. And this other, again, somewhat marshy area that, as you see, eventually goes up to the Meursault, where the Warwick on the of the English, the left of the front line is deployed in front of. And as you understand, here there is a bottling that brings the French against the English line, that in addition, and this is very important in the sources that stress it, and a big deal, was deployed just behind a hedge where, according to some sources also since the previous day, the English had began to dig trenches, etc. Maybe not exactly there, but say all around, because of course when they encamped they erected some fortifications, they feared some raids, some incursions and so on, and the sappers, other non-combatants, surely had some role, maybe even during the same day of the battle, in kind of digging some ditches and so on. But the natural position is strong enough because on the right you have the Maupertuis elevation, which is not dramatically high, so much so that it's suggested that the English, the Anglo-Gascon, we'll talk now about the composition of the English army, were deployed to prevent flanking maneuvers on, again, the English right as a Wagenburg of some sort, but seemingly didn't play any specific role in the battle. And you see here this marsh on the left of the English line. That, and again, this long stripe that arrives of the marsh that arrives up to Maupertuis in front of the French and the English deployment in between them, was probably also crossed by a little stream that today is not traceable, it doesn't exist anymore, but may have existed considering that this is a little valley that eventually flows to the greater Meurson basin. And Byrne convincing, and so I've seen the rest of historiography followed that, convincingly draws this picture. I didn't draw the hedge, but it's as if, it was the front line of the English. It's said that, if I'm not wrong, Salisbury's division was just a stone throw from the hedge, and that's where, in fact, also the English would attack when Clermont, as we will see now, attacked them on that side. And as you understand, this is a very good defensive position for the English that were definitely defending. The French were the attackers, so they had the initiative because they were stronger. And at the back of the English array, there was the Wood of Noyer. It's likely that the English were fearing some kind of flanking maneuver because the French already in the past had been good at that. They had won even battles through that. As we'll see, the thing will reverse in this battle because the French would not outflank, but the English would, and probably winning the battle too in the process. In any case, having the woods on your back, and you see here there is this elevation with sea that the Prince of Wales was also probably looking over the battlefield together with part of the commanders. Either, I don't remember, I think Salisbury was also on that hill with the Prince, eventually sending orders to his own division. Here I will call them divisions or battles, just what this were the battle lines fundamentally. They numbered in this case in the thousands or a small less, and they were the most important tactical units in the battle. Now there is a different version about the development. As far as the French are concerned, what you see is what more or less everybody agrees on. There's a debate relatively to these two little guys in front of the French line. You see there is E, which is the marshals that are Clermont and Oderham, and there are these other two cavalry units in the front. And some sources say that, or one specifically, that there was an engagement between the champions of the two armies in front of the lines, which this man carried out stunts, duels, and so on. Some say that this was in the full chivalric style, so yes, it happened before battles that some of the, especially the newly knighted fighters and or other men who had issues, for example, with one another, would like to confront themselves, testing the moral consistence of the two sides, right? And it was done as a way of selection of the future leaders. These were youngsters normally that wanted to show off and so on. So this is just like as it was done in the comitatus, like the new young people were sent in this kind of all very dangerous frontline attacks, essentially without cover, just to show their individual deeds heroically, and so that they could be, rewarded if victorious, or simply killed in the process. Naturally, in these historical times, we're rather seeing at some much more mediated way of that fighting, but not because they wouldn't beat each other, etc. In this clashes, we're told of broken bones. It was a German knight that was smashed in the shoulder. They were naturally mounted troops mostly, and charging against in this individual ways, one against the other. Another source, however, says that this was also a sort of reconnaissance action, which is kind of obvious because the two armies hadn't really quite seen each other until they approached at, say, 500 meters, and the various French battles came into the clash gradually, as it was normal at the time, one after the other, not to cause problems, domino effects, jams, things like that. Whereas the English army was more sheltered, and the French probably didn't realize the full consistency of it, at least visually, until the end. But this was not a major, say, factor. I mean, the French more or less knew how many the English were, and vice versa. So they had an idea of how many were there left or not. So for the rest, so here you should have also some equivalent of those two little units you see from the French side, also from the English side. Also, what you don't see here is the little Gascon contingent of the Capitale de Bouc that would be so important in the latter phase of the battle, as we will see now, because you can see the track here. There's just a little arrow that follows the all around on the right the hill of Maupertuis. That is the route that the small reserve would cover to eventually attack the French on the flank or the rear. And this was a small unit. We don't know even how big it was. Like, it could be 100 men-at-arms and, I don't know, an equal number of mounted archers and even some infantry. So a small unit, but very important, because flank attacks have a devastating psychological effect, and they had been used famously enough throughout all the Western art of war. For a long time now, from the 13th century, they're very well documented, and they played a major role in these pitched battles. And again, the French, like everybody, used them, telling you the truth. But generally speaking, those who were used to the bigger battles were more aware of the importance of these systems, right? So it's important to stress that Poitiers is not such a huge battle, quantitatively, in terms of numerically speaking. Like, we will see that in the early 14th century, it was normal to have armies of 30,000 men fighting against each other. This is true for the French, for the English. At this point, numbers have shrank through the professionalization of the troops, the broader demographic rises, and so on. So these armies are fairly compact. We will see now the numbers. Probably as it said, 16,000 for the French, 6,000 from the Anglo-Gascons. Some say that actually the French were a bit less, and so that they weren't even that different by scale as an army compared to the English one. I think, yes, the English were in important numerical inferiority. this is suggested just by the way the battle was fought, and by the fact that the French objectively had lots of energies to spend, also just for the sheer size of their army. So I wouldn't exaggerate how many, say how few the French really were. There were so many. Maybe there were not almost 3 times the English, or as other sources that exaggerate definitely say, so much more, etc. Those are actually the two sides are, say, the chronicles come, of course, both from the French and the English side, and it's actually the English that say that the French were a bit less than what it's normally. The lowest figure is it comes from an English chronicle, right? So these sources are fair. It's just that they tell the story kind of their own way. And one important aspect about this all is naturally also how the battle began, because, or what was prompted by, because as we were saying before, the French feared the English to escape, and they saw some movements. Matteo Villani, for example, claims that since the English had been starting to burn some of of what they thought they could not save in the first place, and consider if they had to retreat, right? That's a serious thing, and it's they set them on fire, and the smoke made the French think that the English were literally leaving at that point, and also created a sort of mist, he says, around the battlefield, and that may be a thing that may have caused some further confusion. This aspect is interesting because it tells you how actually desperate the English were, especially for lack of food and water, largely. And in fact, say one criticism that has been moved against John II was that he hurried, right, for this battle. And if he had known in which state the English supplies were, he would have probably waited another bit to make the system collapse anyway. And this was the English understanding. I mean, there were 2 options: either victory or defeat. So in case of defeat, the French would have regained all this stuff that the English had looted during the chevauchée. So the English said, if we lose, those are lost anyway. If we win, we take the entire French army, the royal army will become much, much richer. So you know what, let's destroy an important part of what we looted, because we know just that if we have to retreat and we have to disengage in time, we have to sacrifice this. And this was not said just for the wagons, with all this stuff stored, but also for the people. They, of course, were not killed because also they served for the battle and they were friends. But the Black Prince at some point thought, yes, and as we will see now, a component of the English army remained with horses at hand, especially the elite and the princely division, to get the hell out, and leaving, accepting the fact that lots of troops, if not the majority of the army, would have been left behind in case of retreat. And that's also, understandable, given that he was the heir to the English throne, by the way, and he had to save himself. And similar precautions were taken by the same John II during the battle, when he set properly some of his sons to get away, including, in fact, the Dauphin that would go on to rule after his father was taken prisoner. So as far as the sources are concerned, we will meet some of them, we will quote some of them. We already quoted Villani, there is Froissart, there is Chandos Herald, there is the Chronicle of Les Baker, and that's a very interesting one, and actually the most important altogether, because it describes very accurately this, especially the terrain, the hedges, right? But they're all useful, their own regard. I mean, some of them are just as of the broader 20, of course, just this day's battle was fought, that's it. Right, there are 4 or 5, these ones that we mentioned, that basically tell what happened tactically, and others add some interesting detail. But as I was saying at the beginning, we don't have the time to just look at them entirely. We could, by the way, if you're interested, I can definitely read to you the sources. In another video I can do whatever, like we can talk about the Battle of Poitiers also multiple occasions. But for today, let's try to reconstruct the battle. Right? Now, speaking of numbers, finally, the English army was about 6,000 strong, right? And probably the majority of this contingent was Gascon, right? It was normal because there was this English corps that had left Britain, and then the local troops that joined in Gascony. And relatively to the composition, there are doubts, it's not entirely clear, but essentially this is true also for the French, as we will see. It was a high proportion of men at arms, right? It's as if warfare, especially in these two feudal countries, so also frankly similar to each other, had increased towards just the heavily armored men making the core of the army, and the rest just being, as we will see, the rest being probably 2,000 between archers and crossbowmen. Not just because the Gascons used the crossbow prevalently, differently from the English, likely, but because also the English had crossbowmen among them, and maybe 1,000 ribots and this other kind of mercenary scum, right? And the entire contingent was mounted, by the way, during the expeditions. Here, as the tactical contingency showed, they fought dismounted. And the reason being that, of course, the terrain was difficult for cavalry. We will see it. The French will dismount as well for the same reason. But it does not mean, as it's usually thought, that the English fought only on foot, right? Aside from the fact we will see the English actually fought on horseback too during this battle, as many others, and that during the chevauchée, also many other tactical engagements, of course, mounted warfare was there, and that every man-at-arms was perfectly trained to fight individually and collectively on horseback. Let's say most of these 100 Years' War battles are basically the same old story. There is a larger French force that has to fight the English on a terrifying terrain, and the English are so few that, of course, they don't even think to charge, and to also lose their horses and everything in the process against an enemy that on horseback is stronger than them. They have this terrain. They use combined tactics on foot to try to bog down the French cavalry charges, and they succeed. But the French themselves dismounted, right? They didn't have to just wait for the Battle of Crécy to realize that on some instances they had to dismount. Men-at-arms knew how to discern when they would have had to do that or not, and in this sense you can't even kind of draw a difference between an English or a French men-at-arms in that regard. But this thing we have seen also in other countries. We have seen it in Italy, we have seen it in Germany, we have seen it in Spain. I mean, the idea that the men-at-arms in the mid-14th century basically takes over, and the big infantry contingents of even at the beginning of the century shrank, and also the infantry was present, became kind of less relevant, is a thing, right? In this battle, even the famed English longbowmen, after all, there were a few, right? They probably were not more than 1,500, something like that, which is different from other instances where you see instead that the volume of fire of the English archers was, the number of English archers in the first place was much larger compared to the men-at-arms. So this battle cannot even simply be said, well, look at here, the longbow was so dramatically relevant. First of all, we have explained also recently in that commentary on Shadiversity, battle tactics and so on in the Middle Ages, that any missile trooper is light infantry in this context. Like, so, collectively speaking, when we look at infantry, infantry wings, and these are essentially auxiliary troops to the men-at-arms that, mounted or dismounted, were the center of gravity of the army, and missile troops per se do not win battles, right? These armies were all designed to function with a combined arms tactics that was used successfully also by the English, and unsuccessfully, but I mean, because the entire armies here had, as we will see what happened during the battle, that course with their crossbowmen. But the number of these missiles in this battle is objectively contained. So not even from the English side you have this radical prominence of even just quantitatively of longbowmen. No, it's not that kind of battle. And to see this in perspective with other battles of the 14th century makes you realize that, and also in other parts of Europe, that these two countries fought just like any other, right? That there is not even anything specifically different about the English, right? What really made the system here was perhaps properly the Indian tour, the aforementioned Edward III's military reforms. The French were following the same type of organization pattern, just they were bigger and thus more difficult to regulate. So that's where the quality changed. But there is nothing like, there was such a radically different English way of war for which they won battle. No, they were just better, right? Qualitatively speaking, and that's it. It's not even the longbow, right? Even I discussed this, and this has been also discussed historiographically by scholars in the same Anglosphere, that this hype for the longbow in collective domain is probably very much overrated. Like, it was just because the same volume of fire that normally other formations, that at least it's very difficult to pretend that it was such a different element to other arms. Not that the weapon was ineffective, not that it wasn't used effectively, in that if anything that you find on a battlefield, it has a reason, right? So, of course, it was instrumental to these English triumphs, but still, it wasn't substantially different from what missile troops were employed like, and also on the effect, generally speaking, that really they could cause, including the idea that a longbow shoots much faster, and so, like, do you think that even at a collective level, the factor that determines the entire thing, even comparatively against the crossbow, is just that on a battlefield, again, that the longbow has a faster fire rate? Well, that's a problem, just even properly in polemological culture too. And so that's the easy composition. Like, let's say 3,000 men at arms, and 2,000 missiles, and 1,000 infantry of some sort from the Anglo-Gascon side. Considering probably the majority of the contingent was, in fact, Gascon. And the French army is said, this is the normal number, 16,000, we already said it. So it almost twice the enemy. Some sources, including English ones, say the French were less. And within this numbers, also consider that there are non-combatants included, in specifically from the French side. So the thing could have gone down as far as 10,000 overall, and even within this, probably the majority of troops were not men at arms. Part of the reason is also that we don't know how many crossbowmen the French had, and it's somehow I haven't encountered any source saying it expressly, because normally they don't, but probably all the French divisions here were provided with missile on their flanks, as it was normal, right? So very similarly to what the English did, albeit there is another idea regarding this specific battle that I also find very fascinating about this whole thing. And in fact, I forgot to point out what we think the English deployed their archers like in combination with their men-at-arms. Here I didn't represent it on the map, but it's very simple to follow. So I think most studies today, as I said before, think that the English had a single line of battle, right, with 3 divisions. So Warwick on the left, the Prince of Wales in the center, and Salisbury on the right? So, okay, what are the advantages of this? They covered more front line, so they could avoid encirclements or something like that, except, where would the French encircle from? From one side you have a hill. That again is not a big obstacle. So about that, yes, it's possible the French would even think to outflank the enemy, but there is no news of that. And also probably the English had taken measures accordingly, right, with wagons and just the fact that there is, yes, a small, inclination on the right, and on the left especially, it's unlikely the French could have carried out any outflanking maneuver because there were just marshes. Plus there was this damn hedge in front of the English line. The edge may have been somewhat overrated, because at least it seems that, as we will see, that during the alternation of the French lines in battle, this hedge is surpassed by the same English at some point. So it wasn't, again, the terrain, yes, is very important, obstacles are very important, but what is decisive is the men behind them, not the obstacle per se, right? So this is true also for Crécy, for other battles, where you see that the French cavalry managed under fire to arrive in the English ditches and palisades, and literally to dismounted began to break the palisade, right? So to break through, right? So these hedges are important, and sources vary regarding, the single hedge that seemingly still exists, in part, and it's pretty long, and may actually be the same one the English used. There are some new plans placed somewhere, there are openings, but there is this continuity that fits perfectly what we could reconstruct from the battle as the English defense line. And one prominent source says that this hedge had only one big opening in the middle, where only 5 men abreast could pass through. That would be a very important indication, because it's as if you literally have a wall, you can pass just this narrow part that you can bombard. If somebody gets in, they can't just pour 5 men abreast at a time. However, another source says explicitly that the French began to cross some different the edge at different openings. So of course this hedge was not like the Iron Curtain. But regarding the English archers, there is this idea, of course, that in all the great victories of the English victories of the 100 Years' War, the longbowmen had played this prominent role by shooting from where. And there is this expression that for start use, that is the herse, that would be the harrow, which has been interpreted back in the day also by prominent scholars like Byrne, whose interpretation we're essentially following today, but not on this, in fact, that claimed that this meant that there were some sort of, in fact, units of longbowmen interspersed in front of the line of the men-at-arms, like little fortresses. So imagine the line, you have seen it many times in this misrepresentation, like there is the line of men-at-arms, in front of them you have pockets of longbowmen surrounded by ditches and palisades, so that when the enemy arrives, they can't attack the longbowmen, but they attack the men-at-arms. And so with this small unit tactics, they shoot at guys from the sides, from the rear. This is not really witnessed anywhere. It's somehow small unit tactics are the least important ones, just in case you didn't notice. And what they meant by the hex is literally instead something that refers just to two protrusions at the side. That is to say, literally having two wings of archers right on the flank of the men-at-arms. So, as you understand, for the Battle of Poitiers, there is a difference between between having deployed all the English lines in one on the English divisions in one line, lined up side to side, and having had these, as showed here in the map, two divisions side to side and one in reserve. Now, these divisions, as we were saying for the French as well, had probably the same organic complement. That is to say, this is true also for the reserve of the Capitale de Book. For every battle line that you think in this medieval warfare context, they were composed of heavy and light troops of some sort. If the men-at-arms were mounted, they still had infantry following them on foot on the flanks and providing with this important. It's not much the missile power against the guys, say, that were fighting in the front line. You would think that their purpose was just, the two cavalries are clashing, and when they do back and forth between one charge and another, these guys shoot in between, in the corridor, to the same horses. They also did that, of course, but the main point, first of all, is that the enemy has the same wings, and so, first of all, these guys have to shoot at one another if they want to achieve some result, because what they can do if they take out each other is that the victorious side can eventually make, in fact, the enemy wings break, and they can advance themselves to envelope the enemy flank. And essentially at that point, even if they're light infantry, but attacking on the flank produces all those huge problems that makes eventually the enemy formation collapse. So if you've had again a single English line of battle with the three divisions, one to the side of the other, you would have had essentially the problem of having a certain point between one another, the two wings of archers, and essentially not necessarily a vulnerable point represented by them because they're just light infantry, but let's say some more dispersed and also possibly more disordered and disorderable firepower in between them. What instead the idea of the reserve of the prince on the hill, and properly an entire division on the hill, and the two ones below in the front, and considering what you have on the sides of these two divisions, that is, from what on the right a hill and on the left a marsh, would make us suggest that the English archers and crossbowmen wings, the Anglo-Gascon, let's say better, could be stationed, in fact, just on these two sides. That is to say, between the two divisions, A and B, there was nothing but men-at-arms supporting each other, so creating ideally also some kind of unique line, yes, but of also men-at-arms that could support each other, and this would happen in the battle. And we know also that from the battle accounts that there were definitely on the right archers on the Maupertuis hill, and also archers protected by the marshes on the English left. And so you can easily see there that they may have stepped themselves in the marshes because rather the problem for the marsh was for heavy infantry and cavalry alike, so that we have a passage that explicitly says that there was some French, in fact, infantry. This was the division number E, the one of the marshals, and especially on the right, the one of Autorem. From the other side, we will see Clermont that was shot by the archers. And given that infantry also in general had there were probably troops that were stationed on the flanks of the men-at-arms that were also less armored, were taking casualties, and the French cavalry, that especially in this division in part was properly mounted, the French men-at-arms were properly mounted, so the cavalry in fact decided, since they were well armored and their horses had chanfrons and breastplates, they stationed themselves in front of their own infantry to absorb the English archers' fire. And then Warwick orders this Longbow probably to shift further on the left and to start shooting not the enemy abreast, but from the side where the horses largely didn't have armor, and so taking them down. It's a bit of because it was said that these arrows didn't penetrate the men-at-arms, and also this frontal horse armor. So by instead firing on the side, they started inflicting losses. So this is a bit of a mechanistic explanation that I don't like, and that is, I mean, it's partially true, because of course you have to take in consideration even this aspect that you want to move your missile, that is also a mobile element, as light infantry, from the side that you know they can inflict more damage. Consider that the English didn't have even infinite ammo, by the way, which is something that is usually not like these units were always functional throughout all the battle. No, they would spend easily their own arrows and so on. And this caused losses, and that's allegedly how the right of the Marshal's division was routed in some sort. And naturally, you have always to account that probably saying English men-at-arms, the Anglo... I will say English throughout the whole video, but you understand we're talking about the Anglo-Gascons altogether. They would have a role there, because it's always combined arms tactics. So the idea, again, that here there are two wings of English archers that are essentially shooting the enemy from... I may even add it in the picture, I'm not sure of that, but why not? Yes, I think it's the most convincing explanation, also because it does really seem as if the enemy was attracted in this kind of narrow passage from which on which the archers concentrate their fire from both sides, even though this line was extended, right? So it was a center where this, the arrows could literally reach in the hundreds of meters, cover the entire front, because we're talking about an English front of probably 1 kilometer. So again, even the terrain is difficult, as we've seen, so probably also visibility is reduced. But it's kind of the thing. You have some relatively sheltered position on the hill and on the marshes, especially. You want the men-at-arms to keep fighting frontally in the center, where the enemies are attacking frontally, and from each side they will concentrate their fire. And I mean, in that regard, yes, there is an advantage in attacking the enemy from both sides, but this is the problem, not necessarily in that gap between A and B, that putting archers would have been necessarily more effective there. Maybe just from Warwick's left and Oxford's right flanks respectively, having those archers shooting was quite effective. In the first case, because you had the marshes, so nobody could quite attack them, especially cavalry. That also probably wasn't to be wasted against archers, as we explained, and as it was normally the case, even though probably there was also light cavalry in the French army. And on the right, because it's from an elevated position, and in fact caused important losses both to Clermont and even eventually to King John's division. So I'm not skipping forward, but these things are important to explain why we think that the English archers may have been deployed that way. So this battle was fought on Monday, again, September 19th. The truce between the two armies that were negotiating was terminated at 7:30 a.m., even though at night there had been clashes, and generally speaking, you don't know exactly what's going on. This is an important aspect of the war. Seemingly, the same Prince of Wales at some point made a speech to the English archers while he was still perhaps in the phase in which he was getting away or redeploying for battle, in which he feared that maybe the French were setting up an ambush from the same Noyer wood. I mean, they probably thought the enemy could be around in ambushing them in the process. So the situation was quite delicate. They had arrived just a day before. It's not they knew exactly what was happening all around. It's normal that you think the enemy is going to set up some trap, right? And so that's why in this difficult terrain, archers were so important as well. And this is partly true, of course, for the missiles from the French side, about which we don't have, however, too much information as we have for the English one. But they were there, and they were carrying out essentially the same task, just we don't see perhaps so much effect, except for the fact that possibly in proportion the French had less missile power for each division. This is possible. Just organically speaking, it is the case that the English may have had a greater firepower, but that is also at the expense of, possibly more, say, heavier troops, including ones that can attack archers, even if they were light cavalry themselves. And so this is also a great part of what we don't know, and that's why it's complicated to analyze this battle, like any other. So there are those previous movements with the wagons, and the time for the prince to decide to deploy, also because they were beginning to spot the French vanguard, right? And we have different interpretations on this, because the French thought, again, that they weren't sure whether the English were just moving or destroying their wagons, preparing for battle. And this seems to have been a big problem for them, because they didn't realize that the English had created such a good battlefield for them. Because the idea is that what you see between the Maupertuis hill and the marshes, so where the French would have had to enter, is a dead chamber, right? So they imagine it from the French side. You don't really see behind the hedge and this other forests. There are vineyards, by the way. It's a composite terrain. So you don't know what's there, right? The English were freaking out. This huge French army was advancing on them, but the French were also getting to that wood, and they didn't, let's say, towards that pretty, close terrain. They didn't know what they could meet there, so it was the unknown. Entering there, and then who was there, what were the enemy is doing practically. They didn't know, and so much so that the French marshals had an altercation. French marshals were this first division. They were the marshals of France, Clermont and Auderhem, respectively, on the left and on the right of the division. This was normal. Divisions were subdivided further, and they fought somewhat independent. It was normal to be halved, right? Not more than that. And they began also to compete with each other, right? Say this idea of cowardice, because one wanted to advance more directly. Clermont, especially Auderhem, was kind of more cautious. So this was this idea of saying who was the more courageous would reach the enemy first. And already the fact that they were quarreling about this tells you how problematic the French command was at this point, because of course they were given the order to advance by the king, but the divisions were a bit on their own eventually when they advanced. So not being able to see fully what the English were doing and having different interpretations doesn't help in terms of unit of command, of cohesion, in terms of objective, and so on. There is also this aspect that is pointed out by the sources, that these two subdivisions advanced separately, like in two divergent directions. And the terrain seems to explain why. First of all, the French cavalry was a pretty heavy and unwieldy thing on difficult terrain. Their course led through the vineyard, for example, which constituted a big obstacle. So it was necessary, consider divisions were lined up before, and then eventually they advanced towards the enemy. So having these obstacles in between, and if they wanted to catch an enemy that was supposedly fleeing, they had necessarily to break the formation and to enter in different columns inside this difficult terrain. So it would be normal that, of course, the broader unity of the division to be maintained for the sake of cohesion, but at the same time finding two different paths, and the subdivisions were conceived also for this. So Clermont would advance on the left, and so on probably, and that's what I was saying before, on the Noyer road. So the ones that I don't think we even know where it crossed at the time, because I've seen on Burns' map you have it crossing the Noyer Wood and getting to Noyer. Here we have the road going round the Noyer Wood. This is not so important, right? Probably again the division of Salisbury and Suffolk was located on that road to await for the French, because again, especially if you fear to be outflanked, you have a road that is where the enemy is coming from. Well, you would place yourself on it also to facilitate your own counter measure at that point. And while Alderham took the road of the Gué de l'Homme, right? So towards instead Warwick, and probably getting past the marshes, but getting literally inside the English mouth in that chamber of death. So these two roads also brought directly towards the hedge, right? And probably that's where, say, there wasn't just one passage, right? And the English had surely barricaded and occupied the main choke points. Alderham, especially as we're saying right now, was the one that either met more or earlier resistance of some sort. That was also the English position that I was seeing was better protected by the marshes on the left flank. And in this fight, we have the aforementioned episode of the archers that were firing, and French cavalry put itself in front of them, and then then Warwick orders to the archers to move and to shoot from the side, and there are lots of losses and so on. Naturally, there was the most important thing there was the fight between the men at arms that were the decisive arm, both sides, and there was a bloody engagement. And in this one, the same Marshal Alderham was captured. On Clermont's side, there was instead a greater French success, at least initially, right? And it is possible, and that's why this map actually shows that, differently from Bern, that the Noyer road may have not been so well defended by the English as the Gueux de l'Homme was, the French had greater room for maneuvering. They had they could engage the enemy more successfully, right? And there was in this instance the advance of Salisbury division right up to the hedge, so closing the gap that was said in the sources being lapidis iactu long. That literally means, at stone throw from the hedge, so a few tens of meters, which means that here we don't know again how the terrain really was, where the French began to pour in more consistently from different sides, let's say. But in this sense, it seems that the English needed even to defend themselves, to counterattack more strongly than what was happening on their left, when they were better, relatively better protected and located, right? And Salisbury opposition frustrated the otherwise well-devised operation of Clermont. So overall, the English managed to repulse the French attack of the marshals. As I was saying before, I don't like the mechanistic explanation of the guys, the cavalry taking hits from the archers on purpose because they're armed. I mean, why wouldn't the men-at-arms do that in the first place? Right? What seems here is that the French, first of all, had in the marshal's division both cavalry and infantry. Some others say they were all cavalry. At some point, they dismounted. As we'll see, the other French divisions instead were apparently all dismounted. In part, possibly because they had sent already one division, and so people coming back from it were essentially describing what the terrain was and were telling, look, there is nothing to do. It's better if you dismount. And it was the right thing to do. As we will see, this would create lots of problems for the English because, of course, cavalry in such terrain had problems, but contrarily to how people like to see things in movies that are designed for them, knights are not stupid. If cavalry doesn't work there, they dismount, and they can be very effective on foot, right? The same reason why the English themselves, in part, were on foot. And the thing would follow like that. It would have been senseless to carry out cavalry charges, within that such a difficult space, right? And dismounting, they also managed to hit the English consistently. We don't know with certainty even how many French were present in each of the divisions, right? We don't even know how many troops, as we've seen, there were in the French army. If we take that 16,000 men, first of all, how many men-at-arms do we count? 10,000, 12,000? That it's already a high number. So dividing per 4, we have something between 2,000 and 3,000 men-at-arms, which, yes, does make sense, even though it's pretty... 3,000 men-at-arms would have been normal for armies of 30,000 men, right, at the beginning of the century. So probably there were less. There were something like 2,000. Or even less, and considering that these are 4 divisions, yes, this of course increases the concept of reserve, of gradual use of forces. The French were cautious because, of course, they knew that such difficult terrain, sending too many enemies at once could be a problem. But troops at once could be a problem. But of course, this would expose them more to, say, 2 English divisions that were fighting, as we've seen, in the same place. So fighting against a French one at a time, and probably there wasn't not much that the the French could do. Maybe an outflanking maneuver around Maupertuis would have been interesting. They remained instead very, standard and without broader inventive. We're not informed at least of any flank attack they try to carry out. So it's a sort of an exasperation of the concept of again, of reserve and of deployment in depth, even though they were on the attack. And this may betray a kind of lack of inventiveness of the French army, just channeling their effort just in one place that is hard, and that's why the reason you're deploying exactly so cautiously, right? So invent maybe something getting around the enemy or something like that could be an idea, right? But at the same time, it's still kind of a standard and even good plan, right? Even in this regard, there's not much else you could do. Yes, you could do that flank attack, but with how much larger of a unit, right? And in this sense, counting how much on the entirety of the troops that you are on the mass that you can inject, let's say, in the fight, and on that given crucial central place. So as you see, it's not easy, because if you take something away from somewhere, you also in order to add it to another, you weaken the previous one, and it's a bit complicated. So considering that the English were something like 6,000, you have at least 4,000 men that are that are receiving the attack of likely, again, 2-3, unlikely more than 4,000 men at once, and not necessarily all of them being, men at arms, as we were saying. So being more or less like them in number. The English had the advantage of terrain as well. They were making successful use of combined arms. And they could count also on this fresh reserve themselves, so that even though the French attacks would be hard, there was still not like in the, at least this is the debate, not like in the more modern reconstructions, like the idea of a single line, right? This aspect, I think, is important, because if you again consider the number of the French reserves, the French divisions, and the single numbers, as we've seen, they could be made of, to have just all of your forces distributed, concentrated on the battlefront, like, say, is useless. Like, those 4,000 men are enough to hold that front, and in the worst of scenarios, you have your last forces that can join as fresh troops, and so hoping at least to repel the attack that broke your 4,000. And the enemy must have consistently spent themselves in the process. So this is eventually what will happen, right? And so there probably the flank attack, and so this combined arms, this cooperation with the archers and all that we've seen in the terrain, was played the best possible way from the English side. And from this battle, I frankly acquired even a higher opinion of the Black Prince than I had before, frankly, because it's literally a manual victory. We will see now better. Also, considered from the English side, the French army is largely still unknown in its form. Let's say you don't know how many divisions there are. And the English wouldn't know till the end, as a matter of fact. At some point they thought they had won, instead it was still the royal battle to enter the fight. So that's pretty interesting. However, they recognized that at least this vanguard had been encountered and repulsed. This was even more than a vanguard, because as you will see, there are other 3 French divisions. So this again is typical. Consider there were also probably some extra units even in the front, as we've seen before, those champions. So again, the French deployment is an exasperation of that concept of reserve and in-depth formation that could have probably allocated forces successfully somewhere else, right? And in that sense, it's likely that the English had barricaded their right flank, also joining it likely with the northern extremity of the Noyer Wood. So if the French had scouts, etc., and they had noticed that, well, yes, even that outflanking maneuver would have been very difficult. So the English chose a terrific ground to fight on. And this would go greatly to their advantage. And that's also a very important command accomplishment at the end of the day. So the Marshal's division was repelled. As we've seen, Clermont died. Oderham was captured. We know of important losses among these troops. There were German mercenaries that the French used. The German mercenaries at this point in history, in Italy, in France, in Central, in Northern Europe, were common, right? And they were considered very, very aggressive, very even hot-headed, but let's say the best to send in a straight charge. And definitely this was not the ground where to employ that, inclination to the fullest. In any case, okay, this first attack had been repelled. It definitely doesn't play positively for French morale, but at least there was a much better understanding now of what was there behind the vineyards, behind the hedge. They knew the entire English force was committed for battle, and so now they could really go for it. They knew the terrain better. Those, again, we were coming back from the clash, were describing to the other units what was there. So that's the Dauphin battle advanced on foot this time, and this is a very good idea, because again, cavalry was not to make any breakthrough in such difficult terrain. Dismounting the men-at-arms and any other unit was surely the best thing. This was surely a royal order, and there is no criticism. Actually, it should be praised, and it was the right thing to do. So the Dauphin Charles, and in the process, we know, in fact, this division had been prepared to fight on horseback. Like, at least the French knights shortened their lances from 11 to 5 feet, removed their spurs, and cut off the long toes of their riding boots. I don't know if you've ever seen them. They were designed to hook better with a stirrup. So to be able to march better, to have a more comfortable and a safe grip on the ground. The horses, that were also pretty expensive ones, were sent to the rear. This was a great concern for the English as well. I mean, they had dismounted and sheltered their horses in the rear, albeit, as we will see, they had remained at hand in case the men-at-arms, as it would happen, would have to mount them again. This is especially true for the Prince of Wales division, as it will attack on horseback at the end of the battle. Horses costed an enormous much, right? They costed so much in the 13th century. In the 14th, there is an extra, ultra, further elitization, and there are so many noblemen from all of France, right? The lists eventually, the captured, are very eloquent, and so these were some of the finest men of the realm with the best equipment and the best preparation training, and also they had the best horses. Consider the English men-at-arms were so freaking this moment because, again, it was a terrifying situation that they had not removed their own spurs instead. They thought, here we hold, but if something goes wrong, we have to be ready to mount our horses and get the hell out of here. The advance of the Dauphin battle surely wasn't so spirited if the vanguard had not been destroyed in front of them, right? So imagine advancing on a terrain where you start seeing dead, wounded, even just the obstacle posed by the dead horses that, as we've seen in part, were present in the vanguard and would play for the morale, but also the order of the formation itself. The ground had remained the same. However, the Dauphin battle, and this is a testament to the French military quality, remained orderly, cohesive. So this was normal. In battles, you had to advance on the ground after the clash of the first lines that had left, obstacles, dead people, a terrifying sight. And the Dauphin battle advanced and also fought pretty well. At this stage, we don't hear from the battle accounts anymore about the hedges, right? It's not much because it could have been battered down by the French advance, by the clash and so on, but the fact that probably now most of the English position was uncovered, and so the French knew better where to attack, and as it had happened already on the Salisbury side, the English had to properly counterattack to be more effective against the same French attack. So, in fact, we know one specific source saying that the English stepped further against the enemy, so gaining a momentum that they needed for, again, maximizing the counterattack, while before they had more likely counted on surprise. This is relevant because the same archers in that had probably played an important role, right? The French were advancing on a unknown terrain. The archers could more easily ambush them somehow, and they were also at the highest of their numbers of their ammo availability, and so they could more easily strike in that way, right? And that's why also the archers are mentioned importantly at the beginning, and eventually they would start running out of arrows. And the major credit for the eventual defeat of the Dauphin division goes to the English men, the Anglo-Gascon men-at-arms. This was also a very intense fight. We know that the Dauphin banner was captured, so he was surely in the proximity of the fight, likely in the fight. It was very important for the heir of the King of France, in spite of the risk being run there by the entire country, to prove his own fitness as a man-at-arms. And we know that this fight was fierce. During the course of it, the Prince of Wales reinforced Warwick's part of the line with the bulk of his own battle, right? So this Dauphin attack risked to make the entire English front collapse. The Black Prince also still kept an important mounted force in his own control, right? So not to spend all say unnecessary forces to try to stamp this enemy pressure, right? And again, the freshness of the troops is crucial, because you can even be importantly inferior in numbers, but if you're fresh, you can definitely take on successfully a psychophysically exhausted enemy. And in fact, this choice may have also played a very important factor in the ultimate English victory, even after other two divisions attacks. We don't know so much how long the struggle lasted. It's not even so important. However, long it was, that kind of fight from that kind of forces deeply increased the exhaustion of the English army. Right? Normally, divisions fought just against one, and if they won, they could maybe hope to still keep on fighting against another one, but it was already in a strained situation. Here we were already at the second attack. And aside from advantage and all, the fact that the English army was just, stationary, so they didn't have to advance like the French and so on, but they also had hurried up, they hadn't slept, they hadn't eaten that much or drank that much, so it was and psychologically, again, the situation was not the best because they were against a superior enemy. And in fact, the battle accounts are very clear about this. The English were tired, right? And the interesting aspect of the Dauphin division defeat is that it was not a rout, but an orderly withdrawal. Baker says, non fugam set pulchram retractionem, which means this was not a rout, but a beautiful, like a good-looking withdrawal. And of course, this means that the same Dauphin that probably had seen the heat of the action realized that his own battle was exhausted, the terrain was terrifying, the English were, as we've seen, very determined. As you know, the English armies of the 100 Years' War, especially in this phase, in the armies of Edward III, the Black Prince, were very professional, very qualitative, very motivated, right? Look at the success of the chevauchés. After all, these were all contracted men, right? They knew what they were doing. They were specialists, were professional. However, there is a breaking point for everyone, right? The English were naturally very relieved by the fact that they thought the battle was over, because, by the way, when the divisions alternated, they were distant enough. And so the English couldn't see how much of the French army was left. They had no idea. They would hope like that at every attack that would be the last. Very often armies won battles, but they didn't even know whether there was anyone yet, right, from the other side, because of visibility, because of distance, and so on. And the Dauphin there was clever, realized that his forces were spent, he withdrew in good order, right, and they were done for. They were exhausted, they had suffered losses. By the way, there is a bit of uncertainty where some of the most famous characters here died. For example, there is Walter VI of Brienne, the Duke of Athens. Right, there was a French nobleman who had an important history of failure and success. He was a French nobleman. His father was the one who was defeated and killed by the Catalan company at Cephissus, and that's why, because these were the French that had settled in Greece, and that hence the title of Duke of Athens. He eventually Walter became a vassal of the King of Naples, of the Angevins, and launched this ill-fated expedition against Greece to recover the Duchy of Athens. Then he was offered the dictatorship of Florence, and there was a major rebellion after the Florentine army was defeated by the Byzantines, and he was almost killed by the Florentines, and he was exiled. And then he remained in France, and he died at the Battle of Poitiers. Boccaccio, for example, says nastily that there was a Florentine archer among the English who killed him. But it's probably just a story, a made-up story, but just for telling you also the degree of hatred here. That, for example, Clermont seemingly was killed by Chandos. That was in fact an Occitan knight who accused, and as they had accused each other, they had stolen each other's insignia because they had the same one, and so they seemingly Clermont was captured but killed by Chandos because of this insult during the negotiations that had occurred the previous day. Right. By the way, the English were ordered not to pursue anyone because they knew there were too few compared to the French, and so even though it was plenty of juicy noblemen that they could ransom for, as it would happen, for very elevated sums, of course they had to win the battle first. So there was a very rigid discipline. The Black Prince was inflexible in this. He said, to some commanders who said, look, we have to get out of here because the situation is terrifying, that you will not surrender until I am alive. Because this was the point. You have to hold on, and at some point, as we will see, the English army was about to melt away when they saw the last division advance. Literally, they were exhausted. They said no, and it's hard to fight against your own men after they have repelled 2 divisions, as we will see now, and they just can't take it anymore. And that's when the Prince of Wales example really struck everyone, and that spoke volumes, in my opinion, about his moral resources and also tactical intelligence, for that matter. So the French army was invisible because it was properly behind northern ridge that here is not represented on the map, but is just precluded the English vision. At this point, for other reasons that we will see further, that is to say, there was yet other 2 divisions, but one of the French, but one wouldn't fight, and so the English had some time now to replenish ammo, literally collecting the one that they had already shot across the field. The exchange sound for broken lances. Importantly enough, the treating of the wounded. There is a very graphic description given by Le Baker about this, and the wounded that had to be carried physically away by their comrades. So these were other people that were abandoning the ranks, and in the broader exhaustion, those would be tempted, even probably not to come back to their ranks. So it was a very dangerous situation because there is a sort of exhaustion that at that point enters any kind of activity, and so the spirit properly that keeps together the army may melt away. And this pause, by the way, was fatal for the French as well, because speaking of all, even we don't have the measure of this, but you realize all these apparently little things that are not little at all, but how many they are, may have changed the entire day, right? And the reason for this free time the Anglo-Gascons had was that the division of the Duke of Orléans did not engage. Also about this, we don't know exactly what happened, right? The sources literally say, this division left without having fought. Others say that this was ordered to leave. Also because within this division there were some of the of John's sons, and before the royal division with the king, in fact, came in, probably he told them to get away. So the Dauphin that had already fought, and this other young man, by the way, went away. With his father remained instead the aforementioned Philip, that was 14 at the time, and would gain this glorious nickname of the Bold for his the future Duke of Burgundy for that feat. And the reasons are unclear because, of course, there are moral forces involved. The Duke of Orleans was terribly blamed for this, and it's understandable. Consider 2 divisions had already been annihilated. So this guy, by the way, was 21 years old. He was the uncle of the Dauphin that was younger than him, and that, however, as we've seen, behaved valiantly, the future Charles V. But, in that situation, imagine people coming back with, in blood, broken bones, the disaster, like the dispiriting, the fact that the Dauphin banner had been lost, right? This is a disaster. We're talking about thousands of French noblemen that had already been wasted in this, in a small part killed, but still significantly, and the others, the flower of France retreated in that way because the English had resisted enormously, with this exhausting themselves, by the way. So the moral effect that things can have. This was a fresh division. The English were evidently exhausted, so at that point, a sound military logic would have said, yes, go, attack, right? You see how sometimes things are counterintuitive. That could have made an enormous difference, also because, as we will see, the same king would have, that was in the rear, the last division, would have fought anyway till the end. This division collapsed. Just think, even the morale then in the king's division, that still was made up by the utter best and ultra elite of the entire French military elite, right? So this was also the biggest division, by the way. So they had enough confidence, but hey, 3 divisions have already melted away in front of your eyes, one actually without even fighting. And this is the one of the Duke of Orleans, by the way, that, the Duchy of Orleans had been created also recently, just properly to boost further the idea of important monarchic control on the country, to create this important district. That Orleans would become, with the siege of 1429, Jeanne d'Arc, etc., that symbol. Of course, these people could not know, but it was already something, a really important thing. Consider John II had created the Order of the Star. There were, in this attempt to boost properly the morale, the standards of that French nobility, up to the century before, was literally considered the best thing that have ever existed in the history of mankind, militarily wise, because objectively it was something incredibly great. But now the system had somewhat also relaxed after the great triumphs of the 13th century and the first defeats. Think about Courtrai, think about Crécy. This had questioned, of course, the broader effectiveness of the system, of the state, and the king was deemed to be responsible. So this kind of ideas were felt on the field. Naturally, all these men were loaded with a traumatically fanatic sense of supremacism, racial superiority, exasperated sense of honor. They earned that. I mean, these were really fighting machines in a mental sense that you don't even imagine what it literally means. So even just to see them collapsing like that is a trauma, culturally, spiritually, religiously. It's something incredible. And the king there represents all, right? The France is the Oriflamme, is Saint-Denis. It's properly the blood of the French monarchy. always remember that the French monarchy represents the single most imperialistic power in medieval times, right? It's the concept properly of racial superiority, of divine superpower that the blood of the Capetians genetically means is the life of the entire French people, right? So it's something beyond anything that a 21st century person normally thinks or understands. Here, there were literally universal powers fighting involved, right? So in this terrifying scenario, the division of the Kingdom of France remains alone. They probably knew, as expert men of war, that the English were exhausted. They knew the French were much more. They knew that the English had sustained 2 attacks. They probably knew that they were in dire straits anyway. So there was a big question there, because there was still the possibility of retreating, which would certainly be the more prudent course to adopt, right? But as we were saying before, these are not men like the others. I mean, technically, these are something more than men. Just like peasants are not human beings for them. They embody something. I mean, the Jacquerie, if you don't understand the connection that Poitiers had with the Jacquerie, for example, some of the noblemen that came home after the battle were literally lynched, were cut to pieces by the peasants. They said, these are the traitors of France. These are the ones that literally we break our backs in the fields for a lifetime, because they have the sole purpose of being super people who either they win or they die, taking 50 human beings to the other world in the process, because otherwise, what's the sense of this all, right? So John II knew this, right? And he would leave, sadly enough, to see the consequences. As you know, he would die he died in London, in prison. At some point, he came back to France, but he had given his word of honor that he would have come back to England as a prisoner, because he had to deal with some of the problems were occurring in France after also the Treaty of Bretigny, when the English also were relatively uninterested in what was happening there, and so this was perfectly known, that if the King of France had retreated from the battlefield, if the Oriflamme had not been unfurled, France would have collapsed, or at least would have risked to fall apart, and great part, in fact, of the rest of the 100 Years' War derives from the consequences of this battle, as many other things, of course, but importantly enough, in the Jacquerie, and what that entailed from this, right? So a knight cannot afford to do this, right? It's already a big deal that John, as we will see, accepted surrender after having proven his honor and value, by the way, fighting till the last. Also, his young Philip did so. This man proved to an important degree how worth the French nobility really was, but this was a much bigger thing than in the consequences, that even just the difference between dying and surviving of the individuals was about the survival of the entire country. So there was no way out. King John ordered his division to the attack, right? They could have retreated. All these problems would have been more contained, and also probably the English would have at this point considered the camp, everything was still could be saved from the French side in part, so it would have been an English victory, but definitely a much more moderated one than the last. So there's been some criticism of John's action, because we know that the king's division was very distant from the fighting place, and that there may have been some sort of there was some sort of delay over time. Probably the English were given again the necessary resources to refresh, to prepare to the last attack, even though they hoped they had won. There is a criticism towards the king for having waited too much for the attack or something like that, but I think this is just because the Norman Chronicle says that. Also Villani seems to imply that the fact especially that the king's division was too distant by the Dauphin one. But there was the Duke of Orleans in between, so it seems rather, easy to imagine that had been the main problem. The question is, what did the French king actually do when he saw that an entire division was leaving the field? So it's definitely a problem, but it doesn't seem such a strange thing after all that the king's division was in the bottom of the array, and so it would await for the end before intervening, right? So, and this could create some problems because of, for example, the distance to traverse that some say was eventually exploited by the same English. I mean, the king's division had to cross an important space. It was probably kilometers long before reaching the English positions. In any case, again, these are massive tactical mechanisms that you cannot really avoid. So I don't think even in this the French command can be criticized, right? It was just a critical division politically rather than militarily to attack. If that had not been the French king and those men had not been the flower of the country, that it would have been another thing. But if the fact that they were is the same reason why the war was being fought. So let's say that's the main issue that brought to the disaster, but at the same time you understand what was at stake. I mean, if the French had won, they would have captured or killed the heir to the English throne. So the same people that were claiming they had a dynastic right on their own. By the way, John was and Edward were cousins. So that's also a thing that will come back later, because John wanted to surrender to Edward, not to eventually to the Knight of Artois that acted as an intermediary in the fight. In any case, the English that had thought probably to have already won, and that aforementioned time gap was fueling their hopes about it, spotted probably from the hill of Maupertuis the advance of the royal battle. And this was visibly the largest of the three columns that had been attacking the Anglo-Gascon army. This was also noticed, and it's probably impossible to describe the psychological impact that the mere vision of the royal battle meant for their enemies. At this point, the same English chroniclers say without any problem that the English were devastated by that sight, right? And there is also the general point made by the fact, you see here that usually the French losing, and so they were doomed. And this, do you realize what several, probably here some thousands of the finest men-at-arms of the greatest power in Europe advancing against you? And some say even, John was in numerical inferiority. He may have not been. especially considering the English were exhausted. Even from a moral point of view, this may have not been the case. This was nobody knew how things would go, but of course the moral impressions can deform the entire thing, right? And the king had very good chances of winning the engagement, right? And this is also what really the same English thought at the time, because the Prince of Wales turned to heaven and praying, as the situation was terrifying, in his own army, right? There is a source that is Knighton saying literally, Anglici devenerunt multum lassi pre gravedine certaminis et arma eorum nimis lacerata, right? So that the English had become very, very tired, very, exhausted because of the heaviness of the fight, and their arms were literally, being worn out to the extreme. Broader sense, arms, armor, men in the first place. So the battle up to that point was believed to be over, and that made on the English a terrible contrast with the sight of the advance of the French army. In fact, the same Knighton adds, Dum Anglicis starent lassi se refocillantes et sperantes victoriam reportas. In fact, he says the English were relaxed again, and they were refreshing themselves and hoping to have already reported a victory, or hoping, because they didn't know yet, as we were saying before. Le Baker says the great numbers of the enemy frightened our men. There's another source, the Eulogium, confirming that, quote, many of our men were frightened, nor is it to be wondered at, which is extraordinarily realistic. Also, the Scala Chronica says, quote, the aspect was so formidable that a large number of the prince's men retired beyond a hedge, which is interesting, because as we've seen, the English had here talking probably about the same hedge that was the English line of defense, and this had been surpassed during, especially the fight against the Dauphin. And so now, if that had showed that the English still had enough strength to take on even a second battle, that was a huge deal. Now we did that. It's a miracle. Now it's over. We just even we retreat behind the next useful barrier, and but this is not going to be right. We are exhausted. We can't stand. I mean, do you realize what it means to be psychophysically exhausted after having cut to pieces human beings? I mean, I don't think people just realize what this really means, but in general. And Le Baker also literally says that some of the Anglo-Gascons were beginning to leave the field, right? Quite openly, but especially, as we were said before, those who were escorting the wounded comrades and saying, I'm just after this guy was dying, I can't come back to my position, whatever. So it's at this point that Prince Edward offered up a fervent prayer to heaven. This was, in the life of a man, probably there is nothing like that, right? On average, and definitely if you are in that situation, you realize that whatever is happening is gonna be terrifying, first of all, but the entire fate, say, of your country and the pinnacle of it that you represent essentially as the heir to the English throne depends literally on that, right? And you can't avoid that. You cannot go away, and because the thing would destroy you anyway in the process. And it's definitely terrifying. An interesting point of this also is that while the French knew, of course, that Orléans battle had retreated, the English did not, right? So this may have been easily the third column and not the fourth. So it might have been even another one. Again, the English could not see beyond the northern ridge where the French army had come from. So, of course, they were hoping too that maybe that was all what the French were, but there could be as well even others, right? So at this point, there was a critical choice to make. As we've seen, the English situation was desperate in any way. It was since the beginning of the battle, and now it seemed to have come to the critical point and to what could be seen as the unavoidable. But can you still think to win? And isn't that really makes the entire difference? It can make it. You see, after all, the Dauphin division had been defeated, so that could be. See, the Dauphin was the correspective of the Prince of Wales, so that was an important blow inflicted properly also from a symbolical point of view. The English army, or at least the Prince of Wales, could hope to retreat, to abandon maybe the rest of the army in part and save the elite just, and let the others in the wagons with the loot to their destiny. Or should the English army just have to stay there to await for this attack, and so being eaten alive by the sheer, horror of the magnitude of the enemy host, and fresh one, and of the finest quality, with the Oriflamme, by the way, so showing that was the king approaching, a terrifying vision. Cognitively, it's just destructive. Or shouldn't you be terrified? Or shouldn't you be taken over by despair? Because, you see, this is not just, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about this, it seems like, wow, this is terrifying. When you are there, it's as if there were monsters eating your soul alive and bringing you into the depths of hell, which is literally what would have happened to most of those men. And secondly, just in a political sense, to a defeated Prince of Wales, where all the consequences that this would have brought to England and to the possession of the Plantagenets. Or there is another option, right? The enemy is attacking. You're exhausted. Your men-at-arms are spent. They're mostly morally spent because they don't have any reason to believe in anything or in anyone given them trust, and you are the leader, you're the commander of this man, you have brought them so far, so it's in your hands. A part of them wants to give up because they're exhausted, they prefer even prison, humiliation, shame, to even to death, or even to that temporary suffering, as hard as it is. The archers have spent their arrows, everything seems so grim anyway for yourself as well. But what if you can defy all the odds? What if you have to go towards hell, at least you do it the way that maybe allows you to even get past it? Because you have to get in it in a way or another. Somewhat unexpectedly, the Prince of Wales decided to attack the enemy instead. And I don't know how to tell, how glorious, in military history, as you know, it's like the charge to the bayonet, especially when you have exhausted ammo, etc. The mere fact that the mere power that you are displaying, morally speaking, by the mere fact that you are preparing yourself for the attack after having spent all you've got, because you don't have any other way to offend by charging, is of such a cosmical impact that makes literally the entire Earth shake. There are important reasons why this could be done as well. First of all, in terms of strict military logic, the French division was dismounted as well, so meeting them in defensive, dismounted, because cavalry cannot defend by definition, it's just an attacking arm, would have surely brought to defeat. I mean, the French men-at-arms could enter the same perimeter the others had entered before, and taken over gradually, like infiltrating with that degree of pervasiveness that the infantry has. And as we've seen, the French troops had fought pretty well, in almost even terms. I mean, they had not even been broken by the English. They could simply retreat. Some kind of also, chivalric recognition, of kind of good job keeping us at bay. There was no point, even psychologically, just sitting behind the edge and waiting for these guys to swarm in and taking you over anyway, because they were, too fresh, too strong, also too many probably, compared to you. But the most important reason, that is the moral one, that definitely von Clausewitz praised in this regard, because war is primarily about moral force. I mean, countries do not win or lose wars because they have technology or they have whatever, money, whatever. Wars are won by the morally superior country, people, army, right? You can have the greatest power in the world, but you can't buy morale, right? Because by definition, that is not something to be bought. Say, either you have it culturally or you can't do anything. That's why what we see also nowadays, it's everything is explained. People keep thinking about, it must be drones, it must be things. It's moral, which means cultural superiority. It's something beyond. It's something that, of course, must be measured on the base of course, if you are 50-1, maybe you can win, even without being the morally or culturally superior reality, even though in absolute terms you kind of are if you're 50-1. But, if somebody with severe inferiority, like in this case, on, say, more concrete matters, manages to win, it's because of moral superiority. The moral dimension, spirits exist. They are real quantities in real life. Hard sciences do not consider these, because we have become materialistic in a way that we can't calculate anything except the most important things, that is literally moral forces. And military history is the most powerful debunker of any other attempt to explain history in any other way. So the Battle of Poitiers embodies enormously this. In this last attack, I must say, as you know, I do this for a living. I study wars, campaigns, battles, but such an extraordinary performance like the one of the Prince of Wales at the end of the battle is very rare. It's something really precious, even just from a strictly historical point of view, to encounter, right? The so-called lassitudo pugni, so that sense of exhaustion, of sense that you're spent, that you can't do much more, at that point could be reversed just by the leader. This guy was with them, right? Had shared the blood, the guts, the mud, the dust. Think just about crossing France, storming castle after castle. I mean, it was terrifying, right? They had encountered pretty harsh resistance. They had suffered casualties. They had suffered deprivations of, again, food, water. They had seen people dying together, whether friendly or enemy. And there was a broader purpose of this all, which was naturally evident politically, internationally, uh, to anyone involved, even if for different reasons, but still, that's the reason why armies even exist, as they fight their own battles for. Um, so there was a lot of, that the prince there had to show his troops, right? And the mere audacity of ordering an attack, right, and a mounted attack, by the way. So that is deeply meaningful, because they had met, as we've seen, the enemy on foot, essentially because they were inferior to them. This is something, again, that is deeply overestimated regarding to the 100 Years' War battles. The English, in all these battles, fought dismounted. Why? Do you think because they did, they liked it? It was fashionable. They were inferior. They were radically inferior, numerically speaking. Why all this exploitation of terrain? Because they were a small army. We're talking about 6,000 men. I mean, the largest European armies had normally been at 30,000. Right? So you can do this also in larger battles, but normally when you have an enemy that is almost triple your size, and you engage on, of course, on a much more difficult terrain, also because your army being smaller can fit that in some way, but that is a proof of strategic inferiority. You're not in a good situation. The good situation is the one of the bigger, more powerful, that can advance and attack you. And having the moral power of thinking that, even though he's bigger, is a Goliath-like thing. So for a man-at-arms that was definitely also trained to fight on horseback, and still that horsemanship thing was a deep thing in the equestrian military culture of the Middle Ages. Fighting dismounted, like the commoners, were just like feeling like a rat of some sort. Telling those men that they could mount their own horses and lead an attack, right, against a superior enemy, and having this splendid chance of making history as they did, must have ignited in them an unspeakable moral power. Like, if we have our last resources spent today, if we are to die on this field, let it be like this, and not in another way. This is something that let's be honest, almost none of us will ever even have the possibility of getting a situation of this kind, fortunately. So we can't understand that. But the few that do and have experienced this, the thing turns out to be exactly like that. I mean, not everybody can do it. Not all the circumstances afford you to do so. As we've seen, Edward had maintained this horses near the men-at-arms were somehow told they could use their horses. They had still spurs on during the fight and so on. So the horses were kept away, as we've seen, safely, but still close at hand. This is deeply important. Also because they thought that they may have had to escape, telling the truth. So always bear in mind that the higher that risk and that sense of, you can lose all, and it's because you're more tempted to leave too, right? So this is exactly what we talk about in our Indo-European tradition religion video. In order to transfigure divinely, you have to get in front of the worst of your nightmares. If you don't awake the inferic demon within you, you cannot tame it, you cannot win that battle. So everything is a step away from annihilation, from destruction of the English monarchy, because, let's be honest, had the English lost even just one of the main battles of the 100 Years' War, England would very likely collapse, right? It doesn't matter how good it was for those time standards, thanks, in this case, to Edward's father, reforms too, and so these campaigns had a big toll, and things like the defeat, the capture, the Prince of Wales would have caused a disaster, right? Anyway, right? So this was not just, okay, just sorry French, we were kidding. Like, these were all powers that were deeply and inextricably involved in what they were doing, right? And people who don't understand this in history, studying politics, war, is because they frankly do not know what that politics and those wars really were about and why they were fought. Not just the stupid, pacifistic, whiny garbage of why men always fight, make wars, and so. Yes, there are, people, especially the more you go on in history and the more people de-habituate to history, to literally even to the military art in practice, they're more likely to do stupid things. And again, in contemporary times, just right now, we have pretty good examples of that. But these people lived in war. I mean, they knew dramatically well what they were doing, how and why, and this situation had surely produced itself through many mistakes as well, but that's also part of the unpredictability of the system. So asserting one's spirit so much to launch this cavalry charge against the advancing French king was dramatic, right? We don't know whether the French were again particularly disordered or they didn't have archers. It's been hypothesized because the sources do not tell us, but I think it's fair to say that the Royal Division was just like the best one. They had everything functionally, and yes, they had to cross the entire battlefield. They were probably very worried, and there was something very similar to what we described morally for the English going on among the French as well. So that the decision to attack from the French side was essentially moved by the same considerations as we were saying before. Just the English one was grimmer, without any doubt. And an infantry force, by the way, that was to be charged by English cavalry, and the French didn't know that yet. So that may have played, if anything, as a bit asymmetrically. In any case, there was more than this, because it couldn't be just a simple frontal attack and hoping that even this would simply solve the thing. The tactic had to be completed by some sort of combined action.